Conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books. I am excited to welcome our listeners to the Think About It podcast, and I'm thrilled to have a guest who shares some of my interests in having conversations and who is a longtime teacher but has a different dimension of his background I want to touch upon. So Louis Petrich is tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, one of the great liberal arts colleges in the country, with two campuses, one in Annapolis and one in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And you teach in Annapolis. So first of all, Louis, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and talking about your program called Continuing the Conversation.
Thank you, Uli. My pleasure to be here.
So it's exciting to talk to you. So I've listened in a little bit on a few episodes. So St. John's College has engaged you and a couple other tutors who teach at the college to have conversations that are now made available in the podcast medium. You can find them anywhere on Spotify or Apple, anywhere where podcasts are, where you have conversations that I think emulate or give a bit of a taste of what a classroom or seminar discussion is like at St. John's. And if you can maybe start me out saying a little bit about yourself, what I've scanned from knowing what you've done. You've been a theater director, you've taught in the countries that comprise parts of the former Soviet Union for a while. You've developed a couple of programs, and you've been at St. John's for how long now as a tutor teaching there?
This is my 21st year. Yeah, so I came back to this country to teach at St. John's in 2002. Prior to that, as you mentioned, I was teaching abroad for about a dozen years in the former Eastern Bloc and Soviet countries, because when the wall came down in '89, I went over first as a Fulbright scholar and then in other capacities to teach American studies to people who were reading books from the West and particularly from America for the first time and without the previous attempt to indoctrinate. So that was very exciting. That really was my career, and I'd probably still be there doing something like that if it hadn't been for, well, first 9/11, which changed the world and made it much more difficult to do that kind of work. And at that time, I was in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan. But I always knew about St. John's College from my graduate school days, and it always was in the back of my mind as the place where I belonged, because given my educational background, I did a lot in mathematics and in science and in literature and in history. I was teaching those things abroad. At St. John's, we don't have departments. We don't have majors. We don't give grades. We read the great books across the curriculum. And all the tutors, that's what we call the faculty, teach all of the courses in the course of their career, from the ancient Greeks and the Bible up to books of the 20th century in mathematics, physics, literature, history, philosophy, and some of the social sciences. And that's really all I ever wanted to do, to be a teacher, which is another way of being a student of those books. So I applied in 2002, and they took me on, and I've been here ever since.
I love this because normally I start my conversations with my guests, and I've had a lot of really wonderful guests, and I say, so what's your field? Or what's your area? And what you just said is that you are actually teaching in such a range of fields. It's just daunting and thrilling in a way. And I would like to hear a little bit about how you said you knew you belonged in this place. And I think part of what I'm interested in our conversation maybe is the relation between you as a tutor, the students in the classrooms on your campus, and the community that you're creating, this relationship between the individual and the community. And when I have these conversations with many people who are just very distinguished, have accomplished many, many things, but they usually say, I'm a philosopher and I also work on, I don't know, tech or something like that. Or I'm a literary scholar, but I'm also a theater director or something like that. But they have two or three things, which I already found daunting, but they don't say, oh, I do mathematics. And if we can just jump right into one thing. So if you're teaching, it's the spring term right now in 2023, and you have a group of students arriving on your campus. What is the first classes they take with you as a tutor? And they don't relate to you as this is the guy who does literature with me. This is not the other person and she does math, or this is the person who does physics and she's the person who does this other area. You cover all the areas?
Yes, we do. So there are a couple of, let's say, postulates or assumptions or principles really that we believe in that make this work possible. One is that everybody here possesses common human reason and is therefore able to undertake with the common ground provided by that reason the reading of these books together. And even though the books are very hard in many cases, they're written for people like us, not for experts. And with the proper kind of patience and humility, but also confidence, and the experience provided by the tutors, that's where we come in, the students can take on, in conversation among themselves and with tutor guidance, works ranging from Euclid's Elements and Homer and Plato and Aristotle when they begin as freshmen, to Einstein's special theory of relativity and the literature of William Faulkner and the science of quantum mechanics, all in original papers published by people like Schrödinger and Heisenberg. And then, of course, that's ancient Greece and that's pretty much modern times, much that's in between. So what's remarkable to me about St. John's College is that we're in a way doing what's kind of impossible, but kind of all the time. But something that Emerson said that's always stuck with me. I mean, he was one of the writers whom I first read in college as at the time as a student of math and science, and he was responsible for my switching to literature. He said that everything is impossible until you do it. Mm-hmm. And that in a way is our guiding principle in philosophy, that we can make ourselves equal to it. So it's important, by the way, to say again, maybe that the faculty are called tutors, not professors. We don't profess. The work we do in the class is seminar style discussion, experimentation, and demonstration in the case of math science, but discussion amongst equals. And tutors are simply more advanced or more experienced students. That's how I think of myself. And that's what makes it possible to talk with students in class, because they think of us that way too.
And you said your assumption is that there's a kind of shared capacity for a reason, and that the students come in with the interest and enthusiasm to, I guess, and I'm curious what you would say, to be confronted by these texts, to understand them is maybe too quick, maybe we're skipping something. So what is the experience supposed to be? Because it's very unusual. You're saying you're getting 18-year-olds, probably on average, most of your students are probably around 18, to read yes. original texts in philosophy or in mathematics, and not just an explanatory, very well formulated introduction.
Yes, well, so now you're touching upon another thing that I think has always been impressive to me about this place. It takes, the education is open to anyone. This liberal arts education that is, not focused on any majors, but covers, everything. So it takes a certain kind of person who has a certain kind of belief that in the future, they'll be all right. They don't need to have a major to get a job. What they really need as human beings is the ability to think, to speak, to converse, to write, and to have a freedom of mind and a confidence about the use of that mind that does not, make them subject for the rest of their lives to what experts say, or to doing just, one, say, kind of job in one specific area. So the students that come here have a certain courage about the future. And maybe that's one of the blessings of of being an American and being in America rather than other countries where I've taught, where that kind of approach to learning really is very, very rare. It's even rarer than here. But here, maybe because this is still, comparatively speaking, a land of opportunity and of confidence and of stability, that people can postpone worrying about the future and what they're eventually going to do and just devote themselves to learning for its own sake. That's a wonderful and a beautiful thing that we've got here. But it takes a certain kind of character.
And if they start out, so you enter the room and you have a group of students and you present them with a text, and I'm just trying to sketch for our listeners a little bit this experience of, and they know what is on the assigned reading list for the day. And are you the tutor who covers several different areas? So you're not, this is what I'm trying to get around. You're not a specialized person for them in this way. I teach at New York University, and it's very kind of segmented, that I teach certain subjects, but I certainly do not teach other subjects at all, where I'm not at all considered qualified. But you come in and let's say, and you are doing this range of subjects with them. So they get to know you also, how you relate to these different things.
That's right. Yeah. So, for example, I'm now doing what we call freshman laboratory. Okay. And we're reading sort of the beginning of modern chemistry and physics. Now, I've done a lot of courses in my college days on chemistry and physics, but that's not what I got my degree in. I mean, I was an English major, and in grad school, I went on to do mostly theater and Shakespeare. So and every tutor has their own, specific background that way. Okay, so we all have our own, prior expertises, but I'm teaching Pascal and Archimedes, and on the beginning of thinking about what weight is, what it means for a body to fall to the earth because of its weight. And that's, in a way, the key question of both ancient and modern physics. What causes things to move, either on their own and according to nature? And, and we just start working on that, from the beginning. And, the students know I'm not an expert in physics, but these books, they've been tried and tested for now, since 1937, when the new so-called new program of great books began. And over that time, we've really discovered the ones that work in the classroom, that you can read and really deserve the appellation, great, and that form a coherent programmatic whole that covers 4 years. So, it's a combination of, the character of students and tutors and the choice of the books and the organization of the program and just the way the whole college is set up as a community in which people can talk to each other about what they're doing, because we're all doing the same thing. You see, there are no majors or departments that separate us. And all the upperclassmen have done what the freshmen and sophomores are doing. And so they talk to each other across the 4 years that would normally divide them up. And all the tutors teach throughout the program. So you're with a group of close to 500 people that are all working together on the same thing. And in the case of the tutors, we're always kind of cycling through these courses in year after year. So we're coming back and rereading and getting better at it all the time. So yeah, when we start out, it can be rough. You're doing, one of my colleagues said, never read this book or teach this class for the first time because you don't know what you're getting yourself into. But it's wonderful because, you're with the students, and you need to have that experience of facing those questions and the difficulties the students are having for the first time, so that you can, and you don't forget that. That makes you a better, guide in the future when you come back to it. So I think all those things make it work. We do the impossible.
So, for example, if you're teaching Pascal again, and it's not your first time, do you have experiences where questions come up in a class where you thought, wow, I've never thought of this, or I've never seen it in a text? I've actually taught this text many times. I actually am really interested in these questions of rereading books, and one is read at a different stage in one's life, because we all read things and then we absorb maybe some of it or try to understand, but then we reread them and there's something new in some of these books, really new. And you think, wow, I've read this so closely, so carefully, so many times, and here's something I have overlooked.
Oh yeah, it happens all the time. I mean, that's a test of a book's its liveliness over the years, its greatness, its eternality or universality. So, just last night I was teaching Aristotle's De Anima, which roughly translates as on the soul.
Yeah.
So we were trying to, and this was with a group of graduate students, because St. John's also has a graduate institute, which gives a master's of liberal arts to its students. But it's basically the same curriculum, same books, same faculty, same tutors. And so we were reading On the Soul and trying to understand what Aristotle means by soul. And that's a question that's really dynamite, both then as now. And the question came up, well, is a seed, a soul in a way means something it's what makes something alive rather than inanimate. So plants have souls, animals have souls, human beings have souls, but of different kinds, different types. The question came up, is a seed alive? Does it have soul? And I never thought about that, but it arises in Aristotle himself. A student pointed at it, because that's what we're doing all the time, is noticing things and pointing it out to one another. And that's why it's good to have, people doing this together who have diverse perspectives. They notice different things and said, well, what about this? He says seeds have souls. And he also says that in the case of human beings, the seed comes from the man who puts it into the woman, and that's like putting it in the ground, and there it grows. Does that mean that men have millions of little souls inside them, just waiting to be planted and grown? And, everybody laughed, but I think the answer to that in a way is yes. Yes, we're walking around, we men, at least if in Aristotelian terms, potent with souls. And so that I had never really seen that before, but it's a way of understanding the world as filled with potencies of becoming, of things becoming what they are purposed for. So that's happening all the time. When I teach Shakespeare, which is in my particular area of expertise, if you will, that happens all the time with students. Even though I know the books very well, they'll point at something or ask something that just makes me sit up and say, wow, that's really interesting,
I think that's interesting. I think that's why many of my friends and colleagues, and why I myself teach, is because you are actually constantly reawakened to the kind of original moment of awe or wonder or admiration or love or whatever you have for this book, or even maybe a kind of disagreement, but it's kind of reawakened in teaching, and it becomes a moment and it's shared with others. And I've had on this podcast, I had two guests, John Callahan, who's the literary executor and editor of Ralph Ellison's works, and Deborah Plant, who's the editor of Zora Neale Hurston's posthumously published book Barracoon, and an editor of Hurston's works. And in two separate podcasts, both of them corrected me. I asked them a question about a certain scene in these books, and Their Eyes Were Watching God by Hurston and Invisible Man by Ellison. Deborah Plant and John Callahan both said, Uli, oh, you didn't get the book. And I got something very wrong in a kind of pretty emblematic way, and they corrected me. And it was an incredible moment of actually them opening up a book that I felt I had a certain kind of purchase on, because I, tried to do as much reading around it, and I read it for many years, and I tried to prepare for this conversation. but they saw something and opened something up, which means the book had much more potential than I had been able to see. It contained something else, and that's one thing, because someone else has a different kind of relationship to this and comes from a different place, I think, or has a different kind of maybe experience, like the tutor. I guess in Europe you have much more experience. And the other thing is the questions will change with time. Certain questions become more pronounced to us than they were maybe, or for certain communities, they're more urgent than they were. With Aristotle, I'm going to keep you there for one moment. When you teach the anatomy, I guess, of soul, like, do the questions that are kind of the questions that are being debated quite fiercely in the field of classics right now. So Aristotle's conception of the human, and whether his comments on people who are born to be slaves and his comments on women, how they play out in our contemporary world, where people maybe need a little bit of extra time to reflect on that, to say this is a incredibly important philosopher, and yet there are moments in there that are probably very hard for us to assimilate into our lives as any kind of guidepost for how to live in society.
Yeah, so that comes up all the time. Aristotle's teaching on so-called natural slavery, or the natural slave. Students are they encounter that as freshmen. And it can be upsetting and challenging to them, which is not surprising. But I think the way we handle that or face that is say, okay, look, Aristotle is saying something we don't agree with passionately. Why is he saying it? Where is this coming from? Let's first understand where he's coming from, because he's not just speaking passionately and irrationally. This is part of a larger whole. And if you look at that argument, you're probably aware of this, Uli. Aristotle, I think, says that in some sense we're all slaves insofar as we have bodies, and our bodies are supposed to obey their masters, which is our reason. So we are both master and slaves in being who we are. And people, I think students can appreciate that and sort of agree with that. And then the next step in the argument his argument is, aren't there people who don't command their bodies? They're ruled by them, by their desires, by their passions, by their anger, and so forth. Well, those people really are simply slaves then. They're not the composite master-slave in the right kind of relationship. Well, what's to be done with those sorts of people? And those are the people he thinks are, the so-called natural slaves. They haven't learned to command and rule themselves, and therefore should be ruled. So it's not based on race or any kind of sort of inferiority that belongs to a particular group. It's based on a recognition that there are people, for whatever reason, who are not capable of, of mastering things that need to be mastered in themselves. So, we try to face those really touchy questions rather than duck them or, just appease the students by saying what they want to hear. But let's talk about this, relying again on our common ground of human reason, not trying to silence one another with some kind of appeal to our special experiences of this or that, because that's one way for conversation to come to a halt, when people start talking about their experiences as if that gave them authority over everyone else. But let's look at what's there, talk about it, try and understand it, and do so in good faith, that that we're just trying to understand the truth about this.
Can we stay with this for a moment? I'm quite interested in this, that I think there is, in our moment in their culture, and there's always been in this, I'm sure, that people invoke their own experience to claim a certain authority over something, over some area of life or something. And I think that's actually maybe quite natural in a way, quite human in a way. I think it can be politicized really easily, or it can become, as you said, the end of a conversation. can it also be the starting point where someone says, what would it mean for you or for somebody to invoke their own experience in a way that is not the wrong kind of authority, that informs and deepens the conversation understanding rather than says, I'm going to shut down the other point of view because I know this because I've lived through something. You know, and I'm kind of interested in, of course, many of the texts you're dealing with are, I think, probably navigating this kind of the lived dimension of life and the abstraction of life, or the abstract, I'm calling it abstract, but like a more generalized knowledge.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I often think about that because I think that's where what we do becomes something like an art or techne, a skill that one has to learn and pass on to the students. How do we acknowledge and incorporate our experiences, which is always there and guiding our response to texts and what we're saying about them? I mean, there's some way I agree with Thoreau on this when he says in Walden, you know, we're always speaking in the first person, even when we're kind of formally using third person or objective language. And by the way, we try to do that formally at the college and seminar. We address one another as, you know, Mr. or as Miss or as Mix, and then the last name. We don't use first names. And it's partly because of this that we want to create a formal and depersonalized place for discussion. But anyway, the first person is always there. So I don't have a ready answer to that. It's, you know, it's maybe a certain kind of rhetoric that one has to learn. I mean, how to, you know, make one's experiences part of a discussion of a text in a way that's communicable and acceptable and doesn't upset the common ground that we share. Yeah. So how does one do that?
I think about this a lot, how to use one's experience that does grant some authority. I know some, like I'm saying, you have been involved in theater, you're a Shakespeare scholar, you are much more knowledgeable about this, and you've taught in Iraq or, you know, in Romanian countries. And those experiences, I can say these are really valuable for me to listen to you, to learn from them, or you could use them at some point to kind of shut me down and say, you don't understand that, you don't know what I've lived and seen. And I think to balance out what is authority in the service of actually not continuing a conversation versus this deepens, this can, first of all, you can learn something here. This can deepen something in a way. What, you know, Emerson, so I'm saying your experience is this well of knowledge in a way, but it is, Emerson believes you can share that. You can share experience, right? That's like
that's right. Well, so now you're reminding me of something that's maybe kind of obvious. I should have realized. So the books themselves contain, I think, the experiences that we would, you know, that we claim for ourselves. So that would be the first thing that I would say to myself if I wanted to, if I felt prompted to talk about a certain experience. Can I locate it in the text that we all share at the moment or have shared in the past, and talk about it that way? For example, you know, love. Everyone, you know, is interested in that and is probably had it or is going to have that experience. And rather than talk about, you know, what it was like when I, you know, was in love for the first time,
right.
It's there in Shakespeare, you know,
Right.
and he in a way invented it.
Yeah.
Find it there. But another thing that you mentioned that comes to mind is one can put oneself into the text by reading it aloud, especially if it's literature or poetry or drama, and give it one's own voice, and a real human voice, you know, that has character and experience behind it. So I often do that in class. I'll read, or I'll ask a student to read. And, you know, even if it's something that is, you know, scientific or objective or abstract, you can still find a way to make it come alive as human speech with, you know, a human being behind it. who has excitement or who has confusion or who has anger, and let it show that way. And the other thing that we do, of course, at the college in terms of making experience part of one's learning in a legitimate and appropriate way, one that's shareable rather than authoritative, is we do lab experiments. We go to the board and try and demonstrate in the form of diagrams and step-by-step proofs the things that we're working on in mathematics or in the natural sciences. Those are experiences. It's live learning in imitation of the original process of discovery. And you're vulnerable when you're doing that, because you make mistakes all the time, especially when you're at the board and trying to remember something, and you're making a misstep here and there, and then you have to not be afraid and ask for help, and it usually comes, and you just keep moving ahead. So we're doing it all of the time, and it's, like I said, a skill or an art that the students learn.
And is a lot of the work, do you think, is done in the classrooms or labs? Is that where because they probably have to do a lot of reading and a lot of studying to keep up in a discussion?
There's a lot of reading. Yeah, there's a lot of studying. The expectation is that the students who come here want to do that because they love it.
Yeah.
And since everyone else is doing it, they can be in the company of those who are supporting them, rather than distracting them with things that they might otherwise want to be doing. So a lot is expected of the students that way. On Friday nights, for example, when students elsewhere might be going out to a movie or just a bar to have a good time, we go to lecture. We have lectures on Friday nights. The only time lecture sort of really happens at the college, from tutors or from outside guests, on subject matter that often has to do with the program, but not always. And for an hour, it's a public lecture. Afterwards, it's followed by a question and answer period, which could go on for several hours. So that tells you something about who is here at St. John's.
So it's a lot of work for you too, because you have to reread all these things, right? You can't just walk in and say, "Oh, today is Pascal. Let me grab my book and go to class."
Yes, it is. I'm working all the time, but I love it. It means I'm not doing a lot of things that would probably be bad for me.
That's a good way of looking at it, right? And you love it. You're having fun, right? You're
yes.
To do this. I want to stay with one point because it connects to this project that you are involved with, continuing the conversation, this podcast or a series that is now available to everybody, which gives you a glimpse into the life at St. John's. And you said you engage with any question and any topic. So there's really nothing off limits. And I think, to be honest with you, I think there's a little bit of a caricature of other colleges and universities. I teach at New York University and I spend quite a bit of time at other campuses. I do not have this experience that journalists feel is happening everywhere, that no one dares to speak anymore and everybody is self-censoring. But let's just stay with what you said. You are actually producing part of this conversation, this series called Continuing the Conversation, which is framed a bit about saying there's not the table. You can have conversations about very deep questions, and some of those questions have not been resolved. They're not that, once you master your Rousseau, you got it figured out. You know what property is, and property is the bane of our existence, or the beginning of all evil. Or if you read your Marx or whatever it is, or if you read your Emerson, then you know how to be a free American. It's not, right? So you're interested in when the students walk out of the classroom and you're done with your sessions on Pascal. It's not that they have mastered Pascal and they're done, but something has opened up for them.
That's right. Nothing is ever done. I think it's a central premise of the program, which is how we refer to our 4-year curriculum, that the conversation of the authors is a continuing one from, Plato and Aristotle, the first philosophers we read, all the way down to Heidegger and Du Bois and the later philosophers we read. The questions are not, they're hard questions.
Yeah.
They may or may not have answers,
Yeah.
but we're always asking them and deepening them and going back to them. So what is soul anyway? What does it mean to be alive?
Right.
To have that starts with Aristotle and continues all the way through to Heidegger. What does it mean to see? To have eyes and to see. One of the conversations I did with a colleague named Michael Grenke took up that question with the help of Euclid's book on optics.
Mm-hmm.
And it raises all sorts of subsidiary questions, because Euclid makes in a demonstration, a geometrical demonstration, which claims to prove that we don't see continuously. That is, we can draw a line that is continuous, is not missing any points, but we don't see that way. We see that what our eyes give us is filled with pointillistic gaps, and we fill it in. So our very experience is one of missing things, and it requires a kind of creative contribution or a habitual contribution on the part of us. And that's a question that obviously continues through to Kant and his philosophy and thereafter. What can we actually see and know what's really out there, or is it always being given something by us to make it knowable? I had a conversation that's part of this series with a colleague on Frederick Douglass and Lincoln on the question a word you just referred to, freedom. What does it mean when Lincoln says there's going to be a new birth of freedom in his Gettysburg Address? And we talked about that.
I listened to that moment, and I think your interlocutor, your colleague, said a new birth of freedom means we had some kind of freedom, but it wasn't the right idea. It wasn't the right kind. Something had to be really rethought. And it's not that there's never been freedom, but a new birth means there was something in its place that wasn't quite correct or sufficient or something like that, right? I think I remember this moment in your conversation, which is really interesting when you think that such a simple concept or such a ubiquitous word, freedom, we all know what it means. And especially that, okay, this is the 1850s and 60s in America, the abolition of the slave system is clearly what freedom will bring on. Then your colleague said, well, there had been freedom, just maybe not quite the way it should have been thought through or defined in the proper way.
Yes, right. It's the first birth, turned out to be, either incomplete or unsatisfying, or I'm not sure I'd say wrong, because Lincoln, based the whole Civil War and the rightness of that war on the Declaration of Independence and the first birth of freedom. But he was worried. This is clear in one of his early speeches at the Lyceum I think in the late 1830s, worried that with the passing of that Revolutionary War generation and the founders, and the distance from it, and the way that slavery was not petering out as they had expected, but was actually spreading and growing, that something was really going in the wrong direction. And so one had to give birth yet again, a new birth of that old freedom that didn't go where it was supposed to go, as they had thought it would. But I think he wanted to connect it to that revolutionary moment, so that the Civil War was part two, in a way, of the revolution, of the war for freedom and independence, a real living out of the principles in the fullest sense. Otherwise, the experiment fails, and one might as well go back to Europe, from whence.
And in the classroom, if you're looking at Douglass and Lincoln at this moment, they're I think this is the 1850s, right? And Frederick Douglass gives this well-known speech in 1852, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," where he's very, very careful to say, I actually want to uphold the Constitution and its true principles, and yet it has not been realized. And that's what later we call kind of like a promise, or the check has not been delivered, with Dr. King. But if students bring that up and say, Mr. Petrich, I want to talk about Black Lives Matter, and I want to link that to that right now. I want to talk about that today. Does your class, can you shift and say, no problem, we'll talk about that. No, that's your interest. It's in terms of what can someone bring into a conversation, and at what point do you say, this is really important and really useful, but we're kind of sticking with getting Lincoln right first, or Douglas?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I would say it depends partly on what year the students are in. I'm much more willing to do that kind of break away from the text and talk about how this, this concern for Black Lives Matter, for example, is related to the text when they're seniors or juniors, and they've had experience and have acquired the art of conversation and talking with one another in good faith and with trust. When they're freshmen, I'm much more reluctant to let them sort of break away, because they come here wanting to do that, and that's in a way their habit from high school.
And how do you gently dissuade youth, which, as Aristotle says, have been endowed with enormous amounts of enthusiasm and very little experience? So they have that great advantage. How do you, as a teacher, which is really modeling how as a human being and how as a citizen and how as a person, how do you say, not quite the right moment, or very important question, I acknowledge and I hear this is what's vitally important to you, but it doesn't quite do because it has to be a shared objective. You can't say, well, I'm the tutor and this is what we want to get out of this class.
No, we don't say it never that way. It's more gentle and leading by example. So, if someone sort of brings something up that swerves away from the current mode of discussion about the text, what I'll usually do is not respond to it, not say anything, see what kind of response it gets from the other students, and maybe let it go on for a little bit. And then I'll come back, if it goes on, I think, too long, and say, can we get back to where we were a moment ago when so-and-so was talking about this? Because I thought that was very interesting and we weren't really finished with that point. And, when you do that a couple times, they catch on themselves without having to be told, you're not speaking, properly now. They learn by that example, and because they all, I think, because they chose to come here in the first place and chose a curriculum which is prescribed to them. They don't have choice in their classes or what they read, with just one very minor exception in the junior and senior year. They came here trusting us, not wanting to sort of challenge us all the time about why are we reading this, shouldn't we be talking about this, so they're willing to take that example I just sketched out and learn from it. And by the end of the freshman year, most of them have become what we call Johnnies. They're able to talk to each other without swerving off the road all the time into their own, they're the thing that they want to talk about. And when they get to be juniors or seniors, there's much more room to be able to connect the text to current events in an appropriate way.
So what's your sense when you follow sort of, even a cursory glance at the news will serve this to you, every day, that colleges are, I think, in a quite constructive way, confronted with this all the time. So I teach in a very large institution and I set this curriculum, and students come, and say, why are we reading this and why is this book not on here? And let me just make this point a bit sharper and say, one could and should not have a reading list today in any field, which is, for example, all books written by men, and as if women never wrote anything, and all this gets very complicated access. But those pressures on universities to decolonize the curriculum, to not actually just read the great white men and all that, in some ways, I think that's a productive conversation. I think a lot of my colleagues feel it's maybe the only conversation to have, or they think this is the end of education. How do you're in a somewhat different place, because you are entering into a kind of agreement where people are saying, look, we're in this together. We want to understand something on a very deep level, and we know it has relevance. We're not being taught some obscure thing that has no relevance, but that relevance is not the first order, right? Your priority is not to say make it really relevant for your life. You're getting
Mhm.
it. So what do you think of those conversations happening elsewhere? The pressure on the curriculum, that I actually, I live in that every day, and I think
Yeah.
it's fine. I think it's fine. It's a conversation.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I faced that too, not at St. John's, but when I taught abroad, especially when I taught in Iraq for a year at the American University of Suleimani. My students there, mostly Kurdish, but also some Arabs, would challenge me almost every day because I was trying to give them some of the St. John's approach. We were doing math through Euclid's geometry, and we were doing biology through reading some Darwin, and they had never had anything like this or ever dreamt of anything like that. And what they were interested in was computers, technology, business and finance majors, and things like that. And they would stop my class in the moment, and say, "Why are we reading this? And shouldn't we be doing something else?" And I had to make a case for liberal education and for the value of reading, say, Darwin, because he teaches you something about, perhaps something about why human beings are violent. And this is a very violent part of the world we're now sitting in. So you would-be journalists and politicians in this classroom, ought to be interested in this. But at St. John's, we don't have to do that. In a way, it's a blessing. But in a way, I value what you're saying. I feel myself open to that kind of challenge, and I'm willing to take it on. We have so much to do to understand those books. We don't have the time to continually justify them.
Right.
And I would say they're all relevant to whatever questions are on the student's mind. They are relevant. I think what you are getting at has to do with what now, people refer to as identity. They want a reading experience that somehow reflects the identities of the people who are reading, racial group, ethnic group, religious group, and so forth. But the way I think of it is diversity is very good. That's why we're in this together, because we can see different things in this book and point it out to one another. And the more different things we can see and point out, the better. And that's where the diversity really matters. But the books themselves are that diverse. The books themselves are challenging and contradicting each other all the time. We don't. I don't think one has to have artificial means of doing that.
I think part of the conversation in universities is, part of it is, I think you're right, around I want to see part of my identity reflected in the assignments. And the other part, I think, is also that students and faculty very rightly say this particular canon is a construction that has not just followed the principle, these are all valuable, super important books. It also just happens to be what's been handed down. And then some of our parameters shift. And there's always been the excitement and thrill that things are rediscovered and reshuffled. And as T.S. Eliot said, in traditional individual talent, every new book will reorder the entire preceding canon of all the works because we see them in a new way. So Eliot didn't say a new book of poetry, erases and cancels all the previous poems. Just we see them now differently. We now understand them differently because what has come later gives us a new perspective on that. So I think the second part is more interesting, that they're saying the curriculum or the canon has been a construction. Hopefully, with what you're naming, I think is unusual for universities to say that we're entering into a kind of agreement that we're all in this together to explore what these texts offer and where they fall short and where they are rich and yet to be kind of mined. I think that's really important. I think sometimes students experience the university in very different ways and saying, I have to get through this curriculum, all these books, someone assigned them. I have no idea where they were assigned. There isn't even that reflection. It's just like, these are the books you need to know. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes a very utilitarian, like, why do I need to know them? Because someone said so. And that someone is the work you're doing in the classroom is you're actually enacting that answer, it seems. You're not just saying, this is the book you need to know. It's like, I'm going to make you experience their depth.
That's it exactly. I think we say to our students, at least implicitly, if they have doubts about any of this, okay, well, let's go to seminar and put it to the test. Can we talk about this for 2 hours? For 2 hours,
Right.
and not fall asleep, not get distracted,
Right.
not spin our wheels.
Right.
So every seminar is a test that way, and if it works, what has been working since 37, I mean that I think speaks to the point that these books are rich, and that they do the sort of thing that people are wanting to have done by these other means that you mentioned now. For example, freshman year, we spent a lot of time reading Homer, Plato's dialogues, Euclid's Elements, Aristotle, and you get an image of the Greeks. You might get an image of, the Greeks, whatever that means, as this wonderful, beautiful people who are doing philosophy and reciting poetry. And even when they make war, it's beautiful, it's heroic, and it's all kind of just too good to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And then we read Thucydides, and you get a completely different picture of what it is to be, a Greek person at that time. They're slaughtering each other in the worst possible ways, and there's chaos and there's plague and there's complete breakdown of moral order and of faith and of justice, and it is horrible. And then you say, well, so it wasn't like what I thought when I was reading, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Homer. But so he's in a way, say, deconstructing it. But that's happening right then and there with those authors. Do we really need someone else to tell us that the Greeks, like us, had all of these faults and injustices, and it wasn't just the good, the true, and the beautiful 24/7. So I think that kind of thing is happening all the time within the curriculum.
Is that a continuous understanding of the human, though, in this kind of what you said? There's a kind of realization. Oh, it's not all just poetry and gods scheming, at a lofty level. So but the conception of the human stays the same in this deconstruction, this kind of realization that Greek life is not, this kind of let's say sanitized or idealized version of it.
Yeah, so you're asking are human beings a kind of constant over time?
I think it's just a really critical question, because I think the malleability of the human and the kind of constancy, I think it's a very vital question for all forms of political life and for our self-understanding.
Yeah, I think if one reads, say, books of the Bible or Homer, or others that I can mention, and doesn't feel two things, then you haven't really read them enough yet. One, as I think I've been emphasizing so far, these are recognizable human beings that one can relate to and at least partly understand. But two, there's something very strange here that isn't yet recognizable or me. For example, I did a conversation with one of my colleagues, Erica Bell, on Homer and the Iliad and war. And we spent a lot of time just talking about what it means to see the beauty of war and of killing. Now, that's something hard to recognize these days because we're so far removed from that. And it seems very strange to say, as one of the characters in that book says, that since we're all going to die eventually anyway, and that death is all around us, there at our elbows, and since they say we are great men, and the only thing really to do that makes sense is to go out and fight for glory and honor, and to be the sort of men that we're said to be, and to face death that way. So that I think it's surprising, and it sort of makes you reach for something in the human that you didn't know you had before you came across it when reading it. This, I think, for me, one of the strangest books that requires a kind of expansion of one's own dimensions is the books of the Hebrew Scripture, and also the New Testament. I mean, and to deal with this character called God, I mean, which is, a part of what it means to be human is to have to deal with that character. But it's, it's not simply me anymore or you. We're dealing with, some part of some potentiality, perhaps, of the human being that we can, make progress towards knowing and, increase our own circle, as it were. It's an image from Emerson, by the way, that
yes,
what human life is a kind of expanding the circle of one's soul to embrace more and more of what being is.
I want to ask you two very specific questions. I love this conversation. So the first question, the second one's on Emerson. The first one is on, you said, if we read the Bible and Homer, two things you think we should take away from that. One is that these are human beings, which in some sense means we can relate, which is in itself just staggering that we can relate to something written down such a long time ago in a culture we cannot even comprehend. I mean, we think we have cultural differences, and this is such a vast gulf between us. You think they're human, and then you said they are strange, but they alert us to something very strange in us, or they
That's right.
to certain things in us that maybe we didn't know. Or when you said, when you read Homer and you had your conversation with your colleague, the kind of glorification of war, the beauty of war, I think there's this, let's say what's happening today in the world, there's a lot of admiration in the world for Ukrainian resistance. And it's very difficult to reconcile to say that people are willing and sacrificing their lives, their livelihood, everything for a country, whereas, other people would say this is no longer how the world should be. And we had a lot of people that really rethink and say, I'm against the war, I'm a pacifist, and all that, and say, maybe something in there touches something in the human that we find in Homer, which is that you are called upon to be a warrior at this moment. You're not called upon to sit this out because it's something in your nature. So this strangeness, to go back to this, we're human and we're strange. And that strangeness connects us to others who are also strange to themselves.
That's
so
right.
I'm sharing this. I'm like, oh, I get it. I think I actually don't get it. And I'm kind of troubled by this realization that other people are moved by these things. But maybe I should stay with that being troubled for a moment and say, what part of me has been trained to resist or repress or deny this or pretend I don't have this in me? And what part is just so strange that all I have to acknowledge is that other people are very strange to me. Which is a big step, right? They're strange. They do things I don't get, but if you take that seriously, I mean, not like they're doing stuff and they're just silly and all this. Like, I'm taking it seriously. They're moved in their essence and they're actually they're in harmony with themselves, and something I can relate to.
Yeah, that's very well put. I mean, it's part of the paradox of what we do at St. John's, and I hope it happens elsewhere. On the one hand, we ask genuine questions and genuinely try to answer them, which means, turning our wonder and strangeness into something that we, have that we know, give it an explanation, give it a cause, make it something that is less strange. But on the other hand, we're constantly, reinforcing those questions with other questions and continuing to make it strange. So a lot of times in reading a book with the students, I'll simply say, I'll read a passage and say, isn't that weird? Isn't that wonderful? Or isn't that beautiful? Or, isn't that strange? I mean, just to point out that, that kind of reaction needs to be part of our experience of it. Don't rush immediately into, well, what does that mean? And how can I sort of assimilate this with what I already know? But let it be strange for a while. Just let it be beautiful. Just let it be moving, and allow yourself to be, in that state of wonder or perplexity. Socrates is doing that all the time. It's his mission in life, really, is to bring that about. And the college, in many ways, takes its chief inspiration from the Platonic dialogues and what's going on there with Socrates as he goes around talking to people and asking questions and claiming never to really know, but only to know what he doesn't know. That is to make the world interestingly strange and worthy of continual investigation. That's what we're doing. But combining that here's the paradox again, with really being sincere about wanting to answer our questions. And sometimes we can, and sometimes often we cannot. But I think once you ever give up on answers, it's no longer serious. It somehow becomes more of a game, questions generating questions, and, playing the ironic part of Socrates rather than the one who really wants to know and can know.
No, I think that's interesting. The ironic part, it's interesting. The German romantics, they're very concerned about irony. And the poet Rilke at one point says in one of his letters to the young poet, he said, if you have to use irony, be very, very careful. It is a weapon that almost no one can handle safely, and it'll turn against you because you will have no more belief. Everything will be suspended. And irony is his way of distancing yourself from yourself. And he said there's not a lot of hold. So it's interesting when you're saying when it's a question after a question after a question, it's a kind of a game of speculation.
That's right.
You're saying your experience in the classroom is not that. It is not to just generate more questions, but maybe sometimes to say, this remains a riddle to us. It doesn't mean we have to now stop thinking or we have to keep on asking questions, but something here actually generates a different kind of energy, or I don't know how to say it, like it generates something else. What does it mean for other humans to produce something that can puzzle us in that way?
That's right. So that's one of, I think, the challenges that we face at the college. The students get good at playing the game.
Yes.
As it were, that is at asking questions and seeking an answer, but then asking more questions, at reading later authors who debunk earlier authors, and of experiencing this sort of heightened expectation for the good, the true, and the beautiful that they experience as freshmen, and then having it, disappointed. Not because they failed in their work or anything, but because as they read more and more, they realize that the previous philosophers, who are the greatest minds who have ever lived and written, have been corrected or rejected or debunked by the ones that come after them. So where are you after 4 years when you're a senior and you've done all of that kind of work and have come to the point where you're reading authors who are debunking even reason itself, which, I said at the beginning is our common ground, which makes possible what we do here. Thinkers like Marx or like Nietzsche or like Freud, and who are pointing to, other things that are, ruling over reason itself. And that would seem to debunk even the methodology and the pedagogy that we've been practicing. So it's really quite a challenge to the students to go through that experience. And it sometimes worries me or puzzles me as to, what they go out into the world thinking, what state their soul is in facing the world after this education. I would like to think that it's made them, as I was saying, confident with a certain kind of, freedom, so that they won't feel that they have to rely on experts to tell them, what to do about this thing or that thing or what to think. But, in terms of, the spirit and the happiness and their ability to choose, say, a proper mate in marriage, or a proper friend, a proper line of work. I hope they'll learn something from being at the college to make those decisions, those simple, basic decisions that, really spell the difference between a life that is happy and satisfying and one that is not.
I think it's a really great question to end with, to say, so when you're introducing the great skeptics, so Nietzsche, Freud, um, hiding on a certain way. You sort of turn reason on its head to say, and there's really no basis. And in some ways, I think you're saying, once you introduce that kind of skepticism, what are you left with? And I think it's very important to say Nietzsche is the philosopher of affirmation. He's the yes-sayer. He's actually the one who wants to celebrate life all the time. Freud, in a way, would say, I'd rather disillusion you now, and then we have the capacity to construct meaning in our life, the relationships and these things, then let you live in this illusion that there is some guarantee for happiness and it'll just come to you. In some ways, it activates you as an agent in your own fate. And what Richard Rorty would say, something like, it allows you to construct a livable story for yourself. And I think that moment, but I think you're right, you don't want to get them to this kind of precipice, and then as Nietzsche and Freud may lead you into the kind of the abyss of the total skeptics or the deconstructionists, and there's nothing anymore. I said, no, actually, there can become a moment of that actually gives you the power to construct a coherent story for yourself in life with others.
Yeah.
Rather than accepting these things from other people. Sorry.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. I mean, I myself am actually rather fond of Nietzsche and the life affirming quality, the having to say yes to every moment as if it were eternal.
Right.
But yeah, I think that does mean taking responsibility for creating for yourself, even perhaps in the act of seeing. Perhaps it's rooted in biology and reality that human beings have to create for themselves, responsibly. Here's where the Freud might come in, facing reality, not ducking it. But within that, obeying that responsibility, creating a meaningful, fulfilling life for themselves, which affirms every moment, as a creative moment of yes.
Right.
So
I'm going to ask you one question, if I may, if I'm a student in your class. So this is a very specific question, and you'll get it in 1 second, about Emerson. And maybe it relates to the essay circles. And it's a very specific question. It's something I'm interested in. So we're just doing this in this podcast because I have you here right now. It's really my own thing.
That's fine. I love your questions.
So Emerson, in a way, I think, this is my rough understanding, says ultimately, we as humans, we have this capacity to actually correspond to the world in the following sense, that we can respond to it, we can articulate our experience of it, we are continually awed by it, but we ultimately have the skills, capacity, facility of language to express that. And then I'm going to give you this question now. And the other person who is right next to Emerson, it's Emily Dickinson, same moment in time, writing out of the same world in a way, of course, not having been given the same type of education. And Dickinson, I think, is very different and says, we are continually outmatched by reality. Every blade of grass, every grasshopper, every bobolink, every little bird, every sunrise, it's just so much that all I can do in my poetry is bear witness to the effort to try to say something. But we are outmatched constantly. And actually what's human is that we are constantly summoned to give voice to this, but the poet's only thing is not to give full expression. And that's why maybe in a very simplistic way, Emerson writes philosophical essays and sermons, and Dickinson writes these very bizarre poems of radical originality. And my question is really, this is really a very specific question. Am I kind of right? I think Emerson gives us this kind of sense. We are a good match for the world. You find this everywhere. So Rilke, the early Rilke says, we are perfectly equipped to be placed in this world, which is our habitat. And Dickinson says, we are constantly outmatched. Every time I open my eyes, when I see anything, and all I can sort of articulate is my effort to acknowledge that fact. And it's a little bit too sharp a distinction, but you know what I mean? There's a way in which poetry, I think, touches on, and it doesn't have to be Dickinson, it can be Shakespeare, who says, all I will give you is a person on stage trying to articulate their experience.
Well, I think the two of them together are a very nice way of summing up a lot of what we've been saying. There are two sides of the experience of education and self-formation, the Emersonian side, which is up to the task of giving expression to what's out there by meeting it with what's inside you, with gusto, cheer, and confidence. And even in the face of the death of his son and a personal tragedy and loss, he can manage to turn that experience into another affirmation of life. Whereas Dickens, so that would be the side of what I was calling earlier, asking the questions and answering them, or seeking to answer them with confidence that that's possible. But then there's the strangeness, the mystery, the way in which one is always just stopped in one's tracks and has to consent to a kind of silence in the face of it, where you don't have the word. Maybe in her case you have a dash, or
Yes.
those punctuation marks that she loves to use, where something is happening, I think, in those marks. Or you get to the end of the line in her usually very terse, short poems, a much shorter line than, say, a Whitman line or even a Shakespeare line, because something is holding you back. But I don't think it's necessarily a tragic feeling in Dickinson. I think it can be awe. Maybe that's what you're getting at. Awe in the face of an experience of either God or the absence of God.
Right. I give you the quote of Dickens, never mind, because it's just fun. And it's so helpful what you just said about these two modes, which are kind of maybe the modes we always inhabit, both of them. The one that leads us to speechlessness and the other one that actually also motivates us to express ourselves. And so Dickinson has this line, she says, wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not. A beautiful but bleak condition. He has not lived who has not felt. And then it goes on. And in some ways, what she's saying that wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not.
Yes.
And this Dickinson, which at the hyphen, when she says it's not precisely knowing and not precisely knowing not, the repetition, she's saying it without saying it. She's saying this is the condition we're in, and it's a bleak but beautiful, it's beautiful but bleak condition. We're in this speechlessness, we are contained there. And I think what I get from this conversation, what I want to do is go to college at St. John's.
Please do.
I do.
Would you like to come and give a Friday night lecture?
I mean, this is what I'm trying to work this out. So somehow I love Dickinson, but it seems almost stupid to say something like that, because Dickinson is not containable. I don't even know what to say. But for me, this moment when she gives expression to something that is actually speechlessness, it takes you to a place, I feel.
Yeah.
It takes you to this place, right?
Well, I think that's it. I can't tell you how many times I've felt in class, especially when doing poetry or dramatic literature, even philosophy, where I want to stop the discussion and say to the students, let's just read this aloud, because there it is, and right, we can't do better than that.
Yeah.
And let's just try and hear what's in those words. Yeah. And with Dickinson, I think that's entirely appropriate.
Yeah. It has an incredible depth if you're thinking these very simple words, just a few words here, and sort of it opens up another something else. Yeah. So I just want to again remind our listeners. So you have a series of conversations called "Continuing the Conversation." So you can find that under that title or St. John's College.
That's right.
Available everywhere. There's a series of conversations. They will be released over the spring of 2023. So ultimately, they'll all be available easily. I think they're also on the St. John's website.
That's right. They're being released in stages, starting this month all the way through June. There'll be in that 4-month period about 20 conversations. and they're all over the map in terms of their content.
I think one of my former students and beloved friend, Ron Wilson, who teaches at the Santa Fe College, he's actually one of the guests. So he studied with me at NYU a long time ago as a college student, and then went off to Japan and got his degree at Princeton in Japanese literature, and now teaches at St. John's, and he says to me sometimes, they keep you really busy. I'm doing Euclid today, I can't talk. And I'm like, I get it.
That's right. That's right. All right.
So, Louis, thank you so much for being on the podcast. So again, this was a conversation with Louis Petrich, who is a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, continuing the conversation with some of his fellow tutors who teach at St. John's. And so I invite all the people who listen to Think About It podcast to tune in and subscribe to that series at St. John's as well. I couldn't have thought of a nicer way of spending a Friday afternoon.
Thank you, Uli. I enjoyed it a lot. Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely wonderful. Yes, and we get and I actually, because I have you in front of me, I was like, wait, I have so many more questions, and you've read everything.
All right. Well, choose a book or a topic, and we'll do it again.
I will absolutely do that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.